This is the Multifaith Matters podcast. I'm your host, John Moorhead. Well, this is the podcast for Multifaith Matters. I'm the host, John Moorhead, and I'm privileged today to have a returning guest, David Livingstone Smith. And he is the author of a number of books. But we're going to be talking today, we're going to look at a deep dive. We've had him here before. A section of his book, Making Monsters, the Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. And let me read a little bit of David's bio from the flap inside his book. David Livingstone Smith is a professor of philosophy at the University of New England in Maine. He has published 9 books, including On Inhumanity and Less Than Human, which won the Anisfield Wolf Book Award for contributions to the understanding of racism and appreciation of diversity. David, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be invited back.
Is there anything you want to add to that bio? Anything we should know about you?
Well, let's see. I've won a couple of other awards, the names of which escape me at the moment. But, no, I think that's perfectly adequate.
Oh, great. Well, like I said, you've been here before, and I will include in this links to our previous conversations that we had, so folks can get some more background if they want to go. And we'll summarize a little bit of your work at the beginning, but really the focus of our conversation today will be looking at the monstrosity aspect, the demonization, dehumanization, which is a fascinating concept that you've added to your understanding of a theory of dehumanization. But I think my first question is probably the most difficult one. Can you summarize, because we're building off of that body of work on dehumanization you've done, your theory of dehumanization as you set forth in Making Monsters?
Sure. So it's a really important question to begin with. And it's an important question to begin with because people mean all kinds of different things by the word dehumanization. And it's very, very easy for people to talk past each other when they're talking about dehumanization because they just mean different things by the word. And it's not like there's a right one and a wrong one. They're just different ones. And so right away in any conversation about dehumanization like this one, it's very important to specify, first of all, what one means. And then, as you put it, the theory of dehumanization, which is how it works. I'm going to be very concise here because really the whole book is devoted to fleshing out the details of this account. What I mean by dehumanization is the attitude of thinking of others as less than human, not lesser humans, less than human in an entirely different category. This therefore, is a theory that draws on human psychology, a psychological account of dehumanization, but it's not just a psychological account. By that, I mean, you can't understand dehumanization just by looking at what goes on in people's heads. You have to look at why they have these attitudes. In other words, what forces are impacting them, causing them to think of some groups of others as less than human creatures. So we have to look at the outside world and the inside world because people don't wake up in the morning and spontaneously think of any other group of people as less than human. We need people to get us to think of others in this sort of way. All the historical examples, if you look closely at them, you find that. So dehumanization begins usually, there are variations, but it begins usually with someone or someones in positions of authority, people who are given the role of expert, those who are supposed to know, saying of some other group of people that they might look human, but they're not really human. On the inside, they're something less than human. And typically the language of subhuman animals is used at this point. Now, this is really, really important because human societies make this distinction, and it's been so vital for our development, the development of human civilization. They make this distinction between those who are supposed to know, the experts, those who we confirm in the role of defining reality for us, and the rest of us. And we defer to the experts, as we should, right? You go to a doctor and they give you a diagnosis of what's causing that horrible pain, and you defer, you accept it. Why? Because they're supposed to know. They have the inside information. But people in the role of expert, they might be a scientist, they might be a propagandist for a fascist regime, they might be a celebrity, they might be a radio host, they might be a religious authority. As long as we place them in that role of experts, we're prepared to accept what they say, even if it contradicts what our eyes tell us. Um, and that's really important. So you get people in positions of epistemic authority, experts, and they tell us that some other group of people is less than human. And it behooves us then, it's quite rational for us, in fact, to accept that. But we can't fully accept it. And the reason why we can't is that we are social animals and we are very finely attuned to the presence of humanness in others. So when you and I look at one another, as we're doing now, and the side of the human face, and in particular, the side of human eyes is crucial for this, we just can't help responding to one another as human beings. It's automatic. It's built in. It's part of what it is to be a Homo sapien. So on the one hand, we have people. Let's choose an example. Dr. Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, who says these others, these in this case would be Jews primarily, are not really human beings. But at the same time, even if we are committed Nazis, we can't help looking into the eyes of a Jewish person to recognize that they're human beings. So what happens then, in my view, is we have two things going on at the same time. An image of the other as human, and the image of the other as a subhuman animal. And this transforms them into monsters. That's not all the story, but it's a significant part of the story. So think of it for a moment. I mean, in Nazi Germany, the images of various kinds of animals were used to represent Jews, rats and lice and maggots and so on. But no Nazi thought Jewish people were rats. What they saw them as was rat people. And that's a monster. That gets us to monstrousness. And the added element to this in the sort of dehumanization that we find, say, in genocidal or pre-genocidal situations, is that the dehumanized group of people is also seen as dangerous, as physically dangerous. So they want to hurt you. They're evil, they're corrupt, they're murderers, they're rapists, and they're monsters. They're uncanny combinations of human and subhuman. And this is what makes dehumanization an especially dangerous phenomenon. Uh, because, of course, once you think of others as monsters, as embodiments of evil and destructiveness, then anything is legitimate in dealing with them. right? You don't forgive monsters. You don't have mercy on monsters. You don't try to understand monsters. Monsters are to be, at the limit, exterminated, and sublimit, at least controlled, incarcerated, expelled. Uh, they need to be dealt with harshly.
That is an important summary, and I know it's difficult to take all the work that you've done and the general thrust of your book, Making Monsters. I would encourage folks to seek out the book. We'll include a link in the program notes, and watch our prior conversation where you unpack it in more depth. So thank you for that. Um, Let me begin by saying how important I think this topic is. I work in religious diplomacy, which dovetails with interreligious dialogue and peacemaking. It's a slightly different approach. And many times we ignore the dehumanization element. I think dialogue tends to bring like minded people who already recognize the importance of conversations and already tends to see those they disagree with in positive ways. And we really just need to find common ground. I hope to reach those people who don't come to the dialogue table, who do engage, whether they realize it or not, in dehumanization. And so that's why I think this topic is extremely important. And I hope folks will kind of put it into their menu of things to look at as they try and understand what's going on in human interactions. For the rest of the conversation, I'd like to probe into what you call the problem of monstrosity, which I think is a fascinating topic. How has the problem of humanity led you to recognize that something is missing in theories of dehumanization?
Right. So we have to push the rewind button in my work on time and go back to my very first book on dehumanization, which was called Less Than Human. It was published in 2011. And when I wrote that book, well, I was trying to figure out a lot of things about dehumanization, and I had to figure them out because there just wasn't much of a literature, surprisingly, on dehumanization. Almost all of it was by psychologists. And I had some issues with the way they conceived of the phenomenon and the way they explained it. I mean, not to go into the weeds here, but psychologists would often pay lip service to social and political circumstances, but never go into much depth about it. So they really did tend to see dehumanization in almost purely cognitive terms, almost purely in terms of what goes on in people's heads, at the cost of emphasizing what people's heads are in, the wider social environment. Um, so in that book, I attempted to theorize dehumanization differently than we find in that literature. And basically, I came to the conclusion that when we dehumanize others, we think of them as merely appearing human, but possessing the essence, and I'll return to that term in just a second, of a subhuman animal. Now, when I say a subhuman animal, I mean a kind of animal that we rank as less than human, and when I say less than human, what I mean is having less intrinsic value in and of itself. So things that have less intrinsic value than human beings, it becomes permissible to do all sorts of things to them, which it would not be permissible to do to human beings. You know, we can kill them and eat them and exploit their labor and so on. And that just wouldn't be kosher to do to your neighbors, right? Um, okay, so the picture that I gave there was we dehumanized people are thought of as being really something like rats and lice or bloodthirsty, predatory animals, or traditionally unclean animals, or animals that could be hunted for sport, and so on and so forth. Now, I did theorize something about what made that possible psychologically. And that is two psychological tendencies we have. One is called psychological essentialism. There's a really robust literature on this. And basically, that's our disposition the world over. When I say our, I mean everyone's disposition to divide the natural world up into kinds of living things, species. And this is the crucial bit, suppose that what makes any individual a member of one of these kinds is not its appearance. It's something mysterious on the inside, something that can't be observed. And it's imagined sometimes in the blood, nowadays often in the genes. But it can be something a bit more supernatural. So if we go back a few centuries, and in plenty of communities today, by the way, the possession of a soul is what makes an individual a human being. So it's a human soul. And of course, souls, if they exist, which just by the way, I don't believe, but I would know that many people do, are unobservable, right? You can't, there's no souloscope. You can't see them. You just attribute that. Okay, so that's psychological essentialism, and that makes it possible to look at a being who is in all outward respects indistinguishable from a genuine human being. Say, yeah, but they're not really human because on the inside, where it counts, they're not human at all. They're sort of counterfeit human beings. So that's one bit. The other bit is the tendency to look at beings as arranged on a hierarchy. I call it hierarchical thinking. So traditionally, um, the idea, at least in Europe, it's a very widespread idea. Again, we find this all over the world, despite what some people say. Traditionally, the hierarchy was a hierarchy of perfection. So that tells you something right away. God was placed top of the hierarchy, perfectly perfect. And then we have ranks going down, 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 down to less perfect beings. So in the most popular European version, say in the Middle Ages and a little beyond, you have God at the top and then archangels and then angels. And then, we place ourselves just below the angels and then various other kinds of animals and then plants right down to inert matter, I'm sorry. But notice there are no monsters on that hierarchy. This is important. And monsters were traditionally, you see, this is really, really important, understood as being that were unnatural. They can't be part of the hierarchy of nature if they're unnatural beings. In some of the illustrations of this hierarchy, which was called the Great Chain of Being, you see off to the side of it, rebellious angels being thrown out of heaven. And of course, they're transformed into demonic beings. But they're not on the hierarchy. They're off to the side. They're going down to some sort of other world. So monsters are seen as outsiders to nature, outside of the order of nature, outside of the structure of what should be, outside of God's creation, as it were, if we look at it in a religious context. Right. And so, again, in that first book, I thought, well, when we dehumanize others, what we do is we attribute to them the essence of creatures below the human in whatever hierarchical conception our culture endorses, because there are lots of variations on it. Now, there are two things really wrong with that, uh, which took me about a decade well, less than a decade, actually, about 5 years to come to grips with. One is what I call the problem of humanity, which is if we look at actual cases of dehumanization, the dehumanized members of the dehumanized group are implicitly, or even more commonly, explicitly described as human as well as subhuman. So, for instance, one of the most common phenomena in dehumanization is to characterize the dehumanized group as essentially criminal. But only human beings can be criminal, right? Rats can't be criminal. Lice can't be criminal. Often there's an effort to humiliate members of the dehumanized groups. Make them get down on their hands and knees and eat out of animal troughs, for instance, as was done with African Americans in the United States. Well, it makes no sense to humiliate, you know, worms. Uh, so, and those are the implicit examples, but very often it's explicit. These are human rats, statements of that sort. Um, so there was no room in that original theory for that. And that was an important thing to address because a number of people take that as, or rather, I should say, interpret that phenomenon as showing that dehumanization isn't real. I think, well, they really see them as human beings. They're just, when they say they're subhuman or they're monsters, it's just talk. And I was very anxious to refute that claim. But then I needed a way to fit this into an overall theory of dehumanization in a way that made sense. So that's the problem of humanity. Problem of monstrosity, which you began your question
Mm-hmm.
with, is when we look at actual cases of dehumanization, we see almost always, sooner or later, the dehumanized group are not seen as animals, simpliciter. They're seen as monstrous. And remember what I said, monsters are off the hierarchy. So this whole idea of, well, when you dehumanize people, you attribute to them the essence of a kind of creature that's lower on the hierarchy. It doesn't address the monster phenomenon at all. So what I needed was a way to address both of these problems, the problem of humanity, the fact that dehumanized people are not just seen as subhuman, they're also seen as human, and the problem of monstrosity, which very importantly characterizes dehumanized people as monstrous beings, not simply as subhuman animals, but as monsters.
Well, I find this component of your work fascinating. Since I was young, growing up, I grew up as a monster kid in the
Me too.
1970s. And then I kind of struggle with, do I continue that? Is it a childish kind of thing? But I thankfully came across some academic work looking at what now is known as monster theory.
Mm.
Just found it fascinating and applicable in so many ways. It now has a lot more respectability. You see more scholars willing to talk about it. And I wrestled with myself for years. I have this interest in monsters in pop culture on the one hand, and yet monstrosity as it relates to religious studies and religious conflict on the other. And I came to discover that monstrosity ties it all together for me. I'm just fascinated by how we express our fears through the monster in pop culture, many times wrestling with very serious issues and challenges. And on the other hand, we act monstrously towards religious and political others and so on. And so your incorporation of monsters and monster theory to me is fascinating. And I'd like to unpack some of that. You've mentioned the uncanny
Mm.
from Sigmund Freud. Can you talk about how you found his work important as a
Okay.
piece of this puzzle?
So, when we mention the uncanny in German, unheimlich, uh, often people start with Freud. And I'm a big Freud fan. I was a Freud scholar in my previous life. Uh, but Freud's paper on the uncanny, I don't particularly like, actually. And he didn't start this business. So the real important source on the psychology of the uncanny was a paper published in 1906 by a man named Ernst Jentsch that Freud references right in the beginning of his paper on the uncanny. So I guess we should start with what the uncanny is. Uncanny is, as I mentioned, an English translation of the German unheimlich, and it's a little bit misleading because when people like Jentsch and Freud, and there's some other later people who refer to the same thing in other languages, when they talk about the what we call the uncanny, they mean something with a particular disturbing power. Uh, so in English, we can say, wow, that was an uncannily accurate guess. But that's not what these guys meant by the uncanny. They meant something like creepy, stuff that sends chills down your spine. Now, in Jentsch's original paper, which is well worth reading, basically what he says is we experience things as uncanny when our mind is torn in two directions at once, when we're trying to make sense of them. So you could use the following example, the example of human corpses. So you're looking at let's say your father has died, and on one hand, it's dear old dad lying there. On the other hand, it's a cold piece of lifeless flesh. Now, these are two irreconcilable images, right? And as long as you can't settle on one or the other, you get this creepy feel. That's why corpses are experienced often as disturbing, as creepy, as uncanny. Jentsch gives the example of figures in a wax museum. He's writing in 1906. Of course, nowadays we could draw on computer animations for the same purpose, where they look really lifelike, but they're just a little off,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so there's this moment of doubt. Like, what are they? Are they people or are they lumps of wax? And when you're in that space, you experience them as uncanny. Jentsch said things that move, uh, like uh, robotic things. What were they called back then? There was a word for it. It slipped my mind. Um, the movement is also a very, very powerful instigator of this approach. So if you have like a lifelike doll, but not quite that moves, which was very popular. These were clockwork machines. Again, it's disturbing, right? So this was Jentsch's position. Now, Jentsch's position was sort of, I think, rediscovered uh, in 1960 by a man named Masahiro Mori, a Japanese roboticist, who predicted that as robots become more lifelike, we'll become more and more comfortable with them. But when they're almost indistinguishable from human beings, but not quite, we will fall into what he called, well, in translation, the uncanny valley, this sense of creepiness, of disturbance. Now, the Japanese word was, of course, not uncanny, and it, of course, wasn't unheimlich. It was bukimi, which again means eerie, creepy, disturbing in that unique way. It's not exactly fear. It's what you get when, say, you watch a horror movie. Uh, I think all of your listeners will understand this very special feeling. He also said this, by the way, about prosthetic limbs. He said it's a mistake to make prosthetic limbs, to try and make them resemble non-prosthetic limbs, uh, because they will elicit this sensation of uncanniness. It's better to make, say, a prosthetic hand look like a mechanical hand. than look like a fleshy hand. Um, so if we come back to the account I gave of how my views changed, the account I gave just a little while ago, obviously, then, if we see others as simultaneously all human, not part human, all human and all subhuman, this is going to elicit this uncanny response. Now, how does this go to monsters? Well, monsters are uncanny. The uncanniness of monsters is what distinguishes them from other dangerous things, right? So let's take the monster theorist who has influenced me most is a philosopher named Noel Carroll.
Mhm.
He writes horror fiction, among other things, and he's concerned with what makes a monster. And one of his favorite examples are zombies, not Haitian zombies, but
Right.
monster movie zombies. Now, monsters of that sort, zombies, are simultaneously dead and alive. They're rotting corpses. And it's quite evident by their green complexion and bits falling off them and so on. But they walk around and they try to eat you. And so they're both alive and dead. That just sets them apart from beings like, I don't know, serial killers who are just scary, but they're not uncanny. All right. Think of my favorite example, werewolves. Werewolf literally means man wolf. That's the etymology of it. They're human beings who are also wolves. Now, wolves are scary. My Jewish grandmother, who grew up in Romania uh, very long time ago, over 100 years ago, her mother was chased through the forest by wolves.
Hmm.
That's terrifying, but it's much less terrifying than being chased by a werewolf. Why? Because the calm presence of fear, dangerousness, and uncanniness produces horror. So I see horror as a very special emotional state, affective state. It's different from just fear. It's different from plain old uncanniness either. It's this cocktail of fear and uncanniness. So when we dehumanize others, and I said it's very regular, remember, to see them as essentially criminal, as dangerous, as rapists, as murderers. We're seeing them both as simultaneously human and subhuman, therefore uncanny, but also physically threatening, as dangerous. And this then elicits the feeling of horror in relation to them. And then that feeling of horror drives very often atrocity, extremely cruel and destructive treatment.
You mentioned Noel Carroll's work, and you refer to a concept that he mentions, cognitive threat, but
Yeah,
you prefer another term, metaphysical threat. Can you talk
that's
about
right.
that?
Yeah, so I think cognitive threat I find it a little too dry. And, if someone says cognitive threat to me, I think of being forced to do mathematics, which,
Same here.
you know, which I find highly threatening because I'm hopeless at it, right? So I really prefer my own term metaphysical threat, but we mean exactly the same thing or near exactly the same thing by it. So again, for listeners who aren't familiar with the technical philosophical terminology, metaphysics is the area of philosophy concerned with what exists, what kinds of things there are, the fundamental structure of reality. And I like the term metaphysical threat because when we are confronted with what we consider to be these uncanny entities, we see them as doing violence to the natural order, like the demons off the side of the hierarchy, right? They're not part of the natural order. And there's a sense of the natural order, which is very, very common, um, and often plays a role in religious systems, by the way. Natural order is the order that God has ordained.
Hmm.
It's how things should be. Hence, unnatural acts are to be abhorred, right? They are anathema. Um, so the term metaphysical threat kind of conjures all that up, which is much more directly related to what goes on in dehumanization, and I would argue what goes on in horror fiction. Um, so that's why I prefer that term. Now, I want to make one other point here, which is that um, metaphysical threat is an extraordinarily profound threat. And I think the reason is this. We count on a sense of the order of things in order to navigate the world, to keep ourselves safe, to keep our loved ones safe. We know that, if we see a squirrel, it's harmless, but if we see a rattlesnake, take care. That's all part of this framework of the natural order. But if the natural order can be violated, if there are unnatural beings, then there is no safety and anything can happen, right?
Hmm.
And horror movies really play on this. Really good horror like the Nightmare on Elm Street. Part of the horror of that film is that anything can happen. There is no safety, right? So that then is a call for, in the case of dehumanization, for these dehumanized people to be disempowered, to be crushed. And this can be done righteously because they are insults to the natural order, or in a religious context, in God's order.
Hmm. Yeah, fascinating and powerful stuff. You also, I want to thank you for introducing me to the work of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen.
Mhm.
His book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, Ordinary Germans, and the Holocaust. And you draw upon some of his work and apply it in this context. I would also just add really quickly that with some of the debates and fracturing in the conservative movement in America, these kinds of questions remain tremendously important when
Mm,
some are starting to look at Hitler in positive terms and question the numbers related to the Holocaust and this kind of a
yeah.
thing. But I digress slightly. Can you talk about how you draw upon his work and what it plays in your
Yeah, yeah. So this has to do with another strand of my work, which is what I call the problem of killing. I obviously like expressions, the problem of X, the problem of Y,
hmm.
the problem of killing. And the problem of killing has to do with distinctions that human beings have to make. So like almost all other animals, we have to kill. Life feeds on life. We kill other animals to eat. And even if we're vegans, we kill plants, right?
Hmm.
That's killing too. So we have to take life. But being moral animals, and by that I mean animals that for whom moral considerations are really, really important, we have to justify our acts of killing, you know? So, you know, the mistranslated commandment, thou shalt not kill, really should be understood as thou shalt not kill illegitimately, right? Thou shalt not commit murder, which is illegitimate killing. But, as you know, the Old Testament is full of killing
Hmm.
that is deemed to be entirely legitimate, even
Hmm.
the killing of other human beings. Okay, so we have to make distinctions. And this natural hierarchy idea that I spoke about earlier, I think was a way of legitimating killing some living things, but not others. That is, the lower something is on the hierarchy, the more killable it is. So we can set ourselves apart by placing ourselves high. And of course, the ultimate crime of when we're operating within a religious framework using the hierarchical notion is would be deicide, right? In the Christian tradition, the murder of Christ.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've if you think about that, then you see that dehumanization is kind of a loophole, right? If we consider others as less than human, as categorically non-human, and we demote them, then they become killable. But remember, I think that the recognition of the humanness of others is inescapable as well. It keeps coming back. We can't entirely shake it. And what that means is that there are tremendous resistances in us against the spilling of human blood. You know, we are what biologists call ultra social animals. We're highly, highly social, and our sociality extends way beyond our immediate families and communities, unlike any other animal. I mean, we are our sociality, that's part of the secret of our success, our capacity to cooperate, human groups to cooperate with one another and building something really big and great makes trade possible and so on and so forth. Okay. So what that implies is that killing other human beings and even sublethal violence doesn't come easily to us. It's not like in the movies, right, where people can just shoot each other and they're perfectly fine. There's a great deal of evidence now that the act of killing is itself traumatic for the killer.
Mhm.
Um, so that's kind of put our ancestors in a bind, right? So on the one hand, we have this almost instinctive horror of killing. But on the other hand, we've got these great big brains and we can think, well, it certainly would be advantageous, you know, to enslave or slaughter the ones on the other side of the hill and steal all their stuff and so on. And indeed, if we look at human history, it's full of, it's littered with corpses. So over time, what we did, being clever beings that we are, we've discovered all these workarounds, ways to disinhibit violence selectively. Now, one way, there are lots of them, right? I never, ever, ever, people get me wrong this, I've never said that that killing requires dehumanization. Dehumanization is one method that people have discovered for disinhibiting violence. It's not the only one. It's the use of drugs, the use of rituals, the use of long distance weapons. So you're not confronted with the signals that would inhibit violence. Um, these are all ways that people have found to release violence, which would otherwise be very difficult, if not impossible, to release. Dehumanization is one. Certain kinds of religious ideologies are another, by the way. Um, in a way, certain religious ideologies are kind of mirror images of dehumanization, in that when we dehumanize others, we demote them, but we can also create that kind of moral distance by elevating ourselves relative to those um, who we wish to harm.
Mm. For those
Now,
for those
yeah,
watching and listening, let me just interject here who may be doubting that religious element. Let me point to an Old Testament example, the Israelite destruction of the Canaanites. There
yeah,
are good archaeological reasons to question its historicity. Nevertheless, many conservatives argue for its historicity and its legitimacy.
yeah.
That Israel was justified as God's people and they were engaging in abhorrent practices and would lead Israel astray. Therefore, they were worthy of destruction. So that's just one
Mm.
example that we could point to.
That's a great example. Thank you for that. So uh, people greet this with a little skepticism often. I claim that killing is hard and killing is traumatic for the killer and so on. And this is related to a very famous debate between two Holocaust scholars, one of whom is Daniel Goldhagen, a political scientist, and the other is Christopher Browning, a historian and genocide scholar. And basically, uh, Browning wrote a famous book called Ordinary Men, and it was about one of these units. Let me start that sentence differently. The Holocaust didn't start with the extermination camps. It started with what was called the Holocaust by bullets. So these killing units would move into the new occupied territories in Poland and the Soviet Union, and they would round up primarily Jews, but also others, and shoot them, kill them with a bullet in the back of the head, and bury them in mass graves. If people are interested in that, the book, The Holocaust by Bullets, by a Roman Catholic priest called Father Desbois, is a wonderful, wonderful resource on this. He went out, he interviewed elderly people who had witnessed these killings as children and so on. Amazing book. In any case, uh, so what Browning found in the study of one of these units is that a number of the uh, the troops, uh, the members of what was called Police Reserve Unit 101, were reluctant to perform these acts, and some opted out entirely. Right, we have accounts of a guy going out in the woods and just vomiting repeatedly because it was so horrible. Others could only do it by getting really, really drunk. Um, Many describe traumatic symptoms, nightmares, and so on, consequent to the acts of killing. They had problems with it. And there is evidence that this was such a problem. It seems to have been widely recognized amongst the Nazi senior command. And by the way, the people who couldn't stomach it were not punished. This is, you might imagine from watching Nazi movies that they would be lined up and shot. They weren't. They were given desk jobs or whatever. That it was seen as a sign of moral weakness
Hmm.
that they couldn't do their duty.
Mhm.
Um, so Browning stresses the difficulty that they were having. And as I was about to say, there's evidence that in fact the extermination camps like Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau originated as what Heinrich Himmler called a more humane method of killing. That is humane for the perpetrators because they were getting psychologically wrecked by what they were being asked to do. Um, so that was Browning's view. And Goldhagen, who wrote Hitler's Willing Executioners, which was widely criticized by Holocaust scholars,
Mhm.
said no. These reactions of repulsion were sort of aesthetic if you have brain splattering on you, as evidently happened to Heinrich Himmler when he witnessed a mass shooting. It's nasty, it's disgusting, but it wasn't moral. Or as Browning said, the way Browning interpreted this was deep down, these men were having difficulty killing because it did violence to their moral sensibilities. Um, Now, so this was the dispute. I think both of them were wrong. Uh, I think that was what was likely going on there. And of course, I can't know. It's speculative. It was something pre-moral. What was going on was these men were required to do violence to a very natural inhibition against performing acts of violence. There, in most cases, there's no indication that they saw it as morally outrageous. They just couldn't do it. It's not like, in fact, I would guess, I haven't done this research, but I would guess we would find a pretty substantial level of guilt amongst those who refrained or had difficulty. That, as you know, as Himmler put it in a very famous speech to senior SS officers, this was moral weakness. They just couldn't find the strength to do their moral duty, which was this act of extermination. Um, yeah, compare it to, imagine the Israelites in the Old Testament. Imagine some of them couldn't go in and slaughter not only the men, but the
Mhm.
women and the children and the animals of the Canaanites. Um, well, I would imagine they would feel that they were, you know, uh, they were in the wrong. They were
Right.
behaving wrongly. And that would be the moral component there.
Hmm. Let's take your theoretical work, and I want to apply it in the context in which I've worked and get your feedback on it. And if you have other examples you would like to mention, that would be good as well. A few years ago, I got a grant from the Louisville Institute to try and understand why a minority of evangelical Christian churches engage in neighborly ways to religious others, but the majority either ignore them or react very defensively
Hmm.
and very hostile. And we looked at this in the context specifically of Christian-Muslim relations.
Hmm.
And in my research, I found media personalities in the evangelical world who would refer to religious others in ways that would be dehumanizing along the lines of your first book,
Hmm.
disease metaphors, and other things like that. Poison was one reference,
Yeah.
which brings to mind the need again that we need to account for this. I appreciate the work in interfaith circles, but one leader uses the metaphor of the potluck. America should be a potluck where all the religions bring everything to the potluck and we all feast. And my critique of that, I appreciate the intent, but what do we do with conservative Christians who view those who bring poison to the potluck, right? We have to account for that element of it.
Hmm.
Um, and in additional research, they moved beyond the disease and poison metaphors to draw upon metaphysical threats. So you'll see evangelical Christians talk about Muhammad, the founder of Islam, as a demon possessed pedophile,
Hmm.
or whole religious groups in America who are bringing the demonic, whether it's the Hindu community bringing statues in their temples and this kind of a thing. So it seems that in these kinds of instances, we're not dealing with monstrosity as mere metaphor. They're drawing upon their theological tradition
Yes,
and
yes,
saying
yes,
these are literal demonic monsters.
yes.
What would your thoughts be on that and any other examples you might like to share?
Well, no, I think that's classic. And there are lots of historical prototypes for that. If you look at Nazi visual propaganda, the very, very often, this is gendered, by the way. It's for the monstrification tends to be directed specifically at males rather than females. Um, Jewish men are often represented visually in propaganda as demonic, as and not just represented. So Germans who, I mean, Nazis were uh, overwhelmingly Christian. There were some pagan elements. People like Heinrich Himmler wanted to revive, pre-Christian traditional Germanic paganism. But for the most part, Nazis were Christians of a certain kind of bizarre sort. And that theological tradition informed their representations of Jewish people as demonic, and even it went beyond representations, right? So when the when the airship Hindenburg caught fire over New Jersey in the early 1930s, one reader of the Nazi anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer said that he could see in the smoke an image of a satanic Jew. So literally satanic. Now that drew on very old um, European Christian anti-Semitism. So if I can just give an historical snapshot of
Mhm.
this, because it leads to a larger issue, actually, that's very relevant to what you just brought up. So when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, and after the collapse of the empire of the of of Europe,
Mhm.
basically,
Mhm.
um, there was a problem with, well, what do we do with Jews? I mean, Jews were the only religious minority left in Europe. And, well, it's a complex problem because Christianity is so intertwined with Judaism. So, Augustine comes along in late antiquity and he says, well, look, he said, Jews should be left alone. They should be able to practice their own practices and so on, but in a state of oppression. And that would serve two functions. One is it gave Christianity credibility because look, there are these Jews, they're still around. So, you know, the tradition sort of gets a foundation there. But it was also signaled to pagans, you want to convert, right? You want to have a better life than these Jews. But that was not a bad solution. And it led to relative peace between Christians and Jews for quite a long time. And then that changes in the Middle Ages, in the what is it, the 12th century, late 12th century, where Jews become victims of Christian violence, right? Because they see once we get to some very traumatic phenomena, the particularly the bubonic plague, which people didn't have any explanation for except for kind of demonizing explanations. And more pertinently, perhaps the First Crusade. Then Jews, in the minds of many people, became the other in our midst. There had already been established a connection between Jewishness and and Satanism and the demonic, right? So Jews murdered Christ. They must be demonic. There's this notorious passage in the Gospel of John where, the Jews who don't accept Jesus as the Messiah, he starts telling them that they're the sons of the Satan and liars and murderers like Satan and so on and so forth. So there's this very rich tradition of the demonic Jewish other. And that was extended with ease to Muslims during the Crusades, right?
Mhm.
Now, here's a real problem, and it's reflected in some of the things you're talking about. There are some of these dehumanizing ideas which are foundational to a culture, foundational to a civilization. So we define ourselves over and against them. And in European Christian civilization, it's very much Jews are the other there. In the United States, it's different. It's Africans are the other. So-called black people, I don't believe in race, so I put that in scare quotes, right? Are the other. And when you have these foundational ideologies, it's really hard to get rid of them because lots and lots of stuff is built on them, right? So they're like the foundation of a house, right? it's much easier to fiddle with the windows and the roof than it is with the foundation, because the foundation is supporting all this other stuff. Um, and so we have this legacy in Christianity, which is really hard to shake. And you might think it's gone and people are more enlightened and people are more tolerant and all that, but it bang, it can come right back.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's true. Uh,
Yeah.
David, that was the last question I had. What am I missing? Is there anything else you would like to add that we should know about the monstrosity aspect of dehumanization in this volume?
Well, I think I think this is the most important thing, um, is to recognize it's nothing new. I mean, it's nothing that I haven't just said, but I want to maybe underline a couple of things. Monstrosity, regarding the others as monstrous, is the sine qua non for general in for dehumanization generally. If people just call people animals without regarding them as monsters, my suspicion nowadays is not genuine dehumanization. They don't really believe it. They're using words as weapons.
Mm.
But when people dehumanize others, in my sense of the word, they really, really do believe it. And it's only because they really, really do believe it that it can has the motivational power to lead to atrocity, right? So, um, and it doesn't have to be conventional genocide, right? It can be lots of other things. The murder of disabled children in Nazi Germany, these disabled children were dehumanized and explicitly described as monstrous, soulless lumps of flesh.
Mm.
And thousands were killed. Um, so this is a topic that really needs to be taken seriously, and unfortunately, I don't think it's taken seriously enough. I'll give you an example before leaving. After the horrible, horrible atrocities on October 7th in Israel, um, Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, the defense secretary, made these speeches. And one of the terms that was used was, well, it's not a term, actually. It's one of the statements that was made. We're not fighting human beings. We're fighting human animals. And that human animals, in light of what I've said, that means monsters.
Mm-hmm.
And when you get monsters, nothing is off the table. And I predicted this. As soon as I heard this, I have a Substack newsletter. I wrote one about this, and
I'm a subscriber.
oh, awesome. It came to pass, unfortunately. There's
Yeah.
some things about which I don't like to be right, and this was one of them.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, thank you so much. As hopefully you can tell, I'm a huge fan of your work, and I was just thrilled when I saw Making Monsters and saw the inclusion of monster theory to your work here. And I would just encourage again those involved in interreligious dialogue and peacemaking and interfaith. We've got to account for these elements if we really want to make an impact on those people who are not coming to the table to try and see each other in more positive ways. So thank you again for your work and for
Yeah.
coming back on the podcast.
Well, I want to thank you for your work too. I think you're working at a very important interface, and religion is a very powerful thing. Religion is dynamite for good and for evil. And so, look, I wish religious education was part of every American's education. And what you're doing is really, really important. So thank you.
Thank you. Again, my guest has been David Livingstone Smith. His book, In Making Monsters, The Uncanny Power of Dehumanization. Look in the program notes for a link to David's website and to his work. And as usual, thanks to everybody for watching and listening.